The bowl of soup fell to the marble floor before Charles Whitmore could lift his head. "Get her out of my house," he snarled, not at the maid who was scooping the soup, but at himself. For in that moment of terror, the smell of home-made bread had reminded him of his wife's hands, and that memory was more painful than hunger. Grace Bennet remained unfazed. She knelt, picked up the broken bowl, and whispered, "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Whitmore."
If this story already has your attention, hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and stay with me until the very end. Let's see how far this story travels.
Nobody in the Whitmore mansion said his name above a whisper anymore. Not because they respected him, because they were afraid of him. For 5 years, Charles Whitmore, 60 years old, worth more money than entire small nations, ruler of an empire that stretched across 3 continents, had been quietly starving himself to death in plain sight, and nobody could stop it. 17 chefs had come through that kitchen in 5 years. 17. The last one, a Michelin-ranked woman named Simone, had lasted 11 days before she quit. Sobbing in the hallway, telling the head housekeeper, "He looked at my osso buco like it was poison. Like I was trying to kill him with it." She wasn't entirely wrong, because every plate that touched that dining table reminded Charles Whitmore of the last dinner he'd shared with his wife, Eleanor, the argument they'd had over something so stupid, so forgettable that he could no longer even remember what it was about. Only that she'd grabbed her keys, slammed the door, and never come home. The police called it an accident. Charles called it his fault. And so he punished himself the only way his body would let him, by refusing, meal after meal, year after year, to let food nourish him the way it once had when she was alive, to share it with him. "Mr. Whitmore, your doctor called again," said Harold, the butler, standing stiffly in the study doorway. "He says your blood work came back. He wants to see you immediately." "Tell him I'm busy." "Sir," he said, "if this continues—" "I said I'm busy, Harold." Harold didn't move. In 31 years of service, he'd learned exactly when to push and exactly when silence was the only mercy left to give. This was something new, a quiet, creeping dread that had started keeping him up at night. "Sir," Harold said carefully, "I've hired someone new for the kitchen staff. A young woman. She starts today." Charles didn't even look up from his papers. "Fire her before she wastes her time." "With respect, sir, I already hired her." That got his attention. Charles set down his pen and looked at his butler, really looked at him for the first time in weeks. "You're getting bold in your old age, Harold." "Someone has to be, sir. Before there's nothing left of you to save." Grace Bennet arrived at the Whitmore estate on a gray, rainy Monday morning, carrying a single suitcase and absolutely no idea what she was walking into. She was 30 years old. No culinary school. No fancy resume. Just years of working small catering jobs, a closet full of hand-me-down aprons, and a grandmother's voice that never quite left her head. "People don't always need better food, sweetheart," her grandmother used to say, stirring a pot of something simple on their old stove. "Sometimes they just need someone who remembers they're hurting." Grace had buried her grandmother 2 years ago. She still talked to her sometimes, usually while cooking. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Miss Patterson, walked her briskly through the mansion's endless hallways. "You'll report only to Mr. Whitmore's kitchen staff supervisor. You are not, I repeat, not to speak to Mr. Whitmore directly unless spoken to first. Understood? He doesn't eat. Miss Bennet, I want you to understand that before you start. He hasn't properly eaten in, well, no one's quite sure. Years, some say." Grace stopped walking. "Years? The doctors are worried." "Everyone is worried. But worry doesn't fill a plate, does it?" Miss Patterson's voice cracked, just slightly, before she composed herself again. "Just do your job, and don't take it personally when he throws things. He throws things, you'll see." That evening, Grace stood in a kitchen the size of her entire childhood apartment, staring at a wall of gleaming copper pots that looked like they belonged in a museum. Not a working kitchen. The previous chef's half-finished duck confits had abandoned on the counter, a silent monument to failure. The kitchen supervisor, a nervous young man named Diego, handed her a folder. "This is tonight's menu request from the estate manager. Truffle risotto, pan-seared scallops, a deconstructed." "No," Grace said. Diego blinked. "Excuse me, I'm not making that." "Miss Bennett, I don't think you understand who you're cooking for." "I understand exactly who I'm cooking for," Grace said quietly, already reaching for a pot. "A man who hasn't been fed in years. Not a man who needs fancy food. A man who's forgotten what food is for." Diego stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You're going to get fired on your first night." "Maybe," Grace said, tying her apron. "But I'd rather get fired doing the right thing than keep my job doing the wrong one." She made chicken soup, plain simple, the way her grandmother taught her slow-simmered broth. Tender chicken, soft vegetables, nothing pretentious about it at all. She baked fresh bread from scratch, the smell filling the enormous kitchen with something the room hadn't held in years. Warmth. And she brewed a pot of chamomile tea, the same kind her grandmother used to make when Grace was sick as a child. When she carried the tray up herself against every rule Miss Patterson had given her, the entire household staff seemed to freeze in place, watching her walk toward the dining room like she was walking toward her own execution. Charles Whitmore looked up from his desk and saw the tray. His stomach turned before his mind even registered why. "What?" he said slowly, dangerously. "Is this dinner, Mr. Whitmore?" Grace said, setting it down calmly. "This isn't dinner. This," as he gestured at it with contempt, "this is what you feed a sick child. Maybe that's exactly what you need right now." The silence that followed was so total that Harold, watching from the hallway, felt his heart stop. Charles stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "Yes," Grace said, not moving an inch. "You're a man who hasn't finished a meal in longer than anyone can remember. And everyone around you is too afraid to say it out loud. Get out." No. The word landed in the room like a thunderclap. Nobody said no to Charles Whitmore. Not his board members. Not his lawyers. Not even his own children, on the rare occasions they called. Charles's face went white with fury. He grabbed the bowl of soup and in one violent motion hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, soup splattering down the expensive wallpaper, the crash echoing through the entire East Wing. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't run. She knelt down slowly and began gathering the broken pieces of porcelain with her bare hands, her voice steady even as her fingers trembled. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Whitmore." "Then I'll have you removed." "You can try." His mouth opened. Nothing came out. For 5 long years, he had built walls so thick that not even his own doctors could get past them, and this woman, a maid he'd known for exactly 4 hours, had just walked straight through every single one of them with 11 simple words. He sat back down without saying a word. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. For 5 long years, he had built walls so thick that not even his own doctors could get past them, and this woman, a maid he'd known for exactly 4 hours, had just walked straight through every single one of them with 11 simple words. He sat back down without saying a word. Grace made a fresh bowl of soup, set it in front of him, and said nothing further. She simply waited. Charles stared at the bowl for a long time. Steam curled up from the surface. The smell, simple, warm, achingly familiar, pulled at something buried deep in his chest, something he'd spent 5 years trying to bury forever. His hand trembled as he picked up the spoon. Harold, still watching from the hallway, pressed a hand over his mouth. Charles brought the spoon to his lips. He swallowed. Then, slowly, unbelievably, he took another. By the time the bowl was empty, tears were running silently down Harold's weathered face. though he made no sound at all, terrified that any noise might shatter whatever fragile thing was happening in that room. Charles set down his spoon. He hadn't finished an entire meal in 8 months. He looked up at Grace, something raw and unguarded in his eyes for the first time in years. "Who are you?" he whispered. Grace simply smiled, gathering the empty bowl. "Just the new maid, Mr. Whitmore." But even as she said it, she already knew that was a lie, because sitting across from this broken, grieving man, she'd seen something no chef, no doctor, no relative had noticed in 5 long years. Charles Whitmore wasn't refusing food, he was refusing to be alive. And somewhere down that long, dark hallway, hidden behind a half-closed door, someone else had been watching the entire scene unfold, and whatever they'd just witnessed had made their blood run cold with fear. Because if Charles Whitmore started eating again, everything they had been planning for 5 long years was about to fall apart. The empty bowl sat between them like evidence of a crime neither of them fully understood yet. Charles stared at it for a long moment, then pushed back from the table so fast his chair nearly toppled. "This doesn't mean anything," he said, his voice rough, almost pleading not with Grace, but with himself. "One bowl of soup doesn't change 5 years. "I didn't say it did," Grace answered. "Then why are you still standing there smiling like you won something?" "I'm not smiling because I won anything, Mr. Whitmore. I'm smiling because you're still sitting at that table instead of storming out of it." Charles opened his mouth to argue and found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he had nothing to say back. That silence terrified him more than anything Grace could have said. He stood up, straightened his jacket like armor, and walked out without another word. But Harold, still lingering by the door, saw something in his employer's face he hadn't seen in 5 years. Charles Whitmore looked confused, not angry, confused, like a man who'd just remembered a language he thought he'd forgotten how to speak. By morning, the entire staff knew what had happened. Word moved through the mansion faster than Grace could keep up with the cook, the driver. Even the gardener found excuses to walk past the kitchen just to catch a glimpse of the woman who'd made Charles Whitmore finish a meal. Miss Patterson cornered her by the pantry, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "You disobeyed a direct order last night. I know. You could have been fired on the spot. I know that too. And yet here you are," Miss Patterson said, something shifting in her expression. "Still standing, still employed, and Mr. Whitmore hasn't said a single word about firing you." She paused. "Do you understand what that means? That I got lucky?" "No, Miss Bennet." Miss Patterson's voice dropped low. "It means you did something in one evening that 17 professional chefs couldn't do in 5 years. That should scare you more than it excites you." "Why would it scare me?" Miss Patterson glanced down the hallway, then leaned in closer. "Because there are people in this house and outside it who have spent 5 years benefiting from Mr. Whitmore's condition. And people like that don't take kindly to someone threatening to fix what they've profited from breaking." Grace felt a chill crawl up her spine. "What are you talking about?" But Miss Patterson had already straightened up, her masks lighting back into place. "Just be careful, Miss Bennet. That's all I'll say." That night, Grace made dinner again, this time roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, simple green beans, nothing that belonged on a 5-star menu. Everything that belonged on a kitchen table where a family used to sit together. Charles walked into the dining room already scowling, clearly prepared to reject it on principle. He sat down, stared at the plate, and crossed his arms. "I'm not hungry." "That's fine," Grace said, not moving. "I'll just sit here until you are." "Excuse me." "You heard me." She pulled out the chair across from him, a chair Harold would later admit that hadn't been used in 5 years, and sat down like she belonged there. Charles stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "You cannot sit at my table." "I just did. I could have you fired for this." "You could," Grace agreed. "But you won't. Because some part of you is curious what happens if you let someone sit across from you again instead of eating alone in this enormous house, like a ghost haunting his own life. Charles's jaw tightened. His hand curled into a fist on the table. For a moment, Grace thought she'd pushed too far, that this was the moment he'd finally have her thrown out for good. Instead, his shoulders sagged, just slightly, and something in his eyes cracked open. "Eleanor used to sit there," he said quietly. Grace went still. "Your wife?" He nodded, not looking at her, staring instead at the empty space at the head of the table like he could still see her there. "Every night, for 31 years. Even when we fought, even when we had nothing to say to each other." She sat there. "What happened the last night?" Grace asked gently. Charles's face hardened instantly, like a door slamming shut. "That's none of your business." "You're right," Grace said, not pushing. "It's not. But you're carrying something so heavy it's killing you, Mr. Whitmore. And I think some small part of you brought me into this room tonight because you wanted someone to finally ask." Charles's hands were shaking now, and this time it had nothing to do with weakness. "Get out," he whispered. "No. I said get out." His voice cracked. Ron, furious and utterly broken all at once, echoing off the walls of a dining room built for banquets and family gatherings that hadn't happened in years. Grace didn't move. She simply reached across the table, picked up his fork, and set it gently in his hand. "Eat first," she said softly. "Talk later. Or don't talk at all. But eat." Charles looked down at the fork in his trembling hand like he'd never seen one before in his life. Then slowly he began to eat. Word of the second dinner reached places Grace never expected. 3 floors below the mansion, in a private office connected to Whitmore Industries, downtown headquarters. A man named Richard Colton, Charles's nephew-in-chief operating officer, slammed his phone down on his desk hard enough to crack the screen. She got him to eat again. He snapped at the woman sitting across from him. Twice in 2 days. The woman, elegant, sharp-eyed, dressed in a blazer that cost more than most people's monthly rent, didn't look up from her tablet. "I heard. This is not funny, Vanessa." "I'm not laughing, Richard." Vanessa Cole, Charles's longtime executive assistant, finally set down her tablet, her expression cold as glass. "If he recovers, if he's healthy enough to walk back into that boardroom, everything we've built for the last 5 years collapses overnight." "The board vote is in 6 weeks, Richard said, pacing now, his voice tight with panic. 6 weeks, Vanessa. If he shows up to that meeting looking like a man who's dying, the vote to transfer controlling authority to me goes through without a fight. If he shows up looking healthy." "He won't show up healthy," Vanessa said flatly. "We'll make sure of that." Richard stopped pacing. "What does that mean?" Vanessa's eyes were empty, calculating, utterly without mercy. "It means the maid is a problem." "And problems," she said, standing up and smoothing her blazer, "have solutions." Grace had no idea, of course, that somewhere in a glass office downtown, 2 people were already deciding her fate. All she knew was that something had shifted in the mansion. The staff looked at her differently now. Some with hope, some with a wariness she couldn't quite explain. Even Harold, usually so composed, pulled her aside the next morning with an urgency in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "Miss Bennet," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder like he was checking for eavesdroppers. "What you're doing, it's remarkable. Truly. In 31 years, I've never seen him eat like that. Never seen him speak about Mrs. Whitmore at all. But—" Harold hesitated. "But I need you to understand something. Mr. Whitmore's recovery isn't good news for everyone in this house." Grace felt that same cold chill Miss Patterson had given her the night before. "Harold, what aren't you telling me?" "There are people," Harold said carefully, "who have spent 5 years positioning themselves to take control of everything Mr. Whitmore built, believing, hoping he would never recover enough to stop them. You just became the biggest threat to that plan. That's insane. I'm just cooking his meals." "You're doing far more than cooking, Miss Bennet," Harold said, his voice dropping even lower. You're bringing him back to life. And there are people in this world who would rather see a man buried than watch him wake up. Grace's stomach twisted. Are you saying I'm in danger? Harold didn't answer right away. He glanced down the long hallway one more time, then back at her, his expression grave. I'm saying, he said slowly, be very careful what you eat. Be very careful who you trust, and whatever you do, don't stop what you're doing with Mr. Whitmore. Not now. Not when he's finally starting to remember what it feels like to be alive. Grace's hands were trembling as she walked back into the kitchen that evening, Harold's warning echoing in her ears louder than anything else in the house. She picked up a knife to start dinner, and for the first time since arriving at the Whitmore estate, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, wondering, for the first time, exactly who else was watching her every move, and exactly how far they were willing to go to make sure Charles Whitmore never finished another meal again. The knife slipped in Grace's hand, nicking her thumb, and she barely noticed the sting. Harold's words wouldn't leave her alone. Be careful what you eat. Be careful who you trust. She stood in that enormous kitchen, blood beading on her finger, feeling for the first time like the walls of the mansion were closing in around her instead of sheltering her. Diego noticed her hesitation as she stared at the tray meant for Charles's dinner. You okay? Fine, Grace lied, wrapping a cloth around her thumb. Just tired. But she wasn't tired. She was scared, and scared people either ran, or they dug their heels in deeper. Grace chose the second option. That night, dinner was simple again, pot roast, the kind her grandmother used to make on Sundays, slow-cooked until it fell apart at the touch of a fork. When she carried it in, Charles was already seated, which surprised her more than anything he could have said. You're early, she said. I got hungry, he admitted, and something about the way he said it, almost sheepish, almost human, made Grace's chest tighten. They ate in silence for a while, the kind of silence that no longer felt hostile, just careful, like two people learning a new language together. Then Charles set down his fork. Tell me about your grandmother, he said suddenly. Grace blinked. Why? Because every time you talk about her, you get this look on your face. Like she's still in the room. He paused. I want to know what that feels like. I used to have that look too. I don't anymore. Grace felt her throat tighten. She raised me. My parents weren't really around. She used to say food was never about the food, it was about making someone feel like they mattered enough to be fed. Charles was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor used to say something similar. She said a home wasn't the walls or the furniture. It was whoever you sat across from at dinner. Do you want to tell me what happened that night? Grace asked gently. The last dinner? Charles's hand tightened around his napkin. For a moment, Grace thought he'd shut down again, thought she'd pushed too far too fast. But then, quietly, brokenly, he began to speak. We argued about something so stupid I can't even remember what it was anymore. A dinner party. A guest list. Something meaningless. His voice cracked. She said I cared more about my company than I cared about her. I told her that wasn't true, she said. Then prove it. And I didn't. I just sat there, and she got up, and she said she needed air, and she took the card. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. It wasn't your fault, Grace said softly. You don't know that. I know that no argument deserves what happened to her. And I know that punishing yourself for 5 years hasn't brought her back. It's just taken you away too. Charles looked up at her, eyes glassy, unguarded in a way Grace suspected he hadn't been in front of another living soul in half a decade. Why do you care so much? He whispered. You've known me for days. Because somebody has to, Grace said simply. And everyone else in this house has been too afraid, or too busy pretending everything's fine, or she stopped herself. Or what? Grace hesitated. She thought of Harold's warning. She thought of Miss Patterson's cryptic dread. But looking at Charles now, fragile and open in a way she never expected, She decided he deserved to know. Mr. Whitmore, I think there are people around you who don't want you to get better. Charles's expression shifted instantly, the softness replaced by something sharp and alert. What are you talking about? Harold warned me yesterday. Told me to be careful. Said there are people who spent years benefiting from you being sick, and that they wouldn't be happy if you started getting healthy again. Charles's face went pale, then hard, like a man remembering something he'd tried very hard to forget. Richard, he muttered. Your nephew. He's been running my day-to-day operations for 3 years. Ever since Charles gestured vaguely at himself, at the 5 years he couldn't quite name out loud. Ever since I stopped being able to function. There's a board vote in 6 weeks. If I'm deemed unfit to continue as chairman, controlling authority transfers to him permanently. Grace felt her stomach drop. And if you're healthy, then the vote doesn't happen, or it happens and fails. Charles's jaw tightened. Which means every single day I've spent finishing your meals. Getting stronger, feeling more like myself again every single day has been a day closer to Richard losing everything he's spent 5 years building toward. Do you think he'd actually try to hurt you? Charles didn't answer right away, and that silence terrified Grace more than any answer could have. I think, he said slowly, that I built an empire by learning never to underestimate what desperate people are willing to do. The very next morning, the first sign of trouble arrived disguised as kindness. A gift basket showed up at the kitchen door, expensive chocolates. A bottle of fine olive oil, a handwritten note that read, Welcome to the family, Grace. Looking forward to working together. Richard Colton. Grace stared at it, unease crawling up her spine. Diego, oblivious, reached for one of the chocolates. Don't, Grace said sharply, grabbing his wrist. What? Why? Just don't. She had it tested. She didn't even fully understand why some instinct, some warning bell Harold had planted in her that refused to go quiet. 2 days later, the results came back from a lab friend of Diego's workday. The olive oil was fine. The chocolates were laced with a sedative not lethal. Not enough to kill, but enough to make someone violently ill for days. Enough to make Charles Whitmore miss the exact kind of dinners that were bringing him back to life. Enough to make him look, once again, like a man too sick to run his own company. Grace's hands shook as she held the lab report. They tried to poison him, she whispered. She brought it straight to Charles that evening, laying the report on the table in front of him instead of dinner. He read it in silence, his face growing colder with every line. Until finally he set it down and looked up at her with something Grace hadn't seen in him before. Not grief. Not confusion. Fury. Get Harold, Charles said quietly. Now. Within the hour, Charles Whitmore, a man who hadn't left his private wing in months, was sitting in his study with Harold, Grace, and his head of security, going through 5 years of financial records with an intensity that stunned everyone in the room. Pull every transaction Richards approved in the last year. Charles ordered. Every vendor contract. Every board communication. I want to know exactly how deep this goes. Sir, are you certain you're strong enough for? I am not, Charles cut him off. Going to sit in this house and starve to death so my nephew can inherit an empire he tried to poison me to get. He looked at Grace, something fierce and alive burning behind his eyes for the first time in 5 years. Not anymore. Grace felt a chill of both fear and something like pride settle over her. She had come to this mansion to cook soup for a grieving old man. She had no idea she just helped light the fuse on a war that was about to consume an entire empire, and that somewhere downtown, in a glass office with Richard Colton's name on the door, 2 people were about to discover that the maid they'd underestimated wasn't nearly finished yet. The security footage arrived at midnight, and nobody in that study slept for what remained of it. Frame by frame, Charles's head of security, a former federal investigator named Marcus Reyes, laid out 8 months of evidence across the desk like pieces of a puzzle nobody had wanted to see completed. Wire transfers routed through shell companies. Vendor contracts signed at double market value. The difference quietly funneled into accounts with Richard Colton's initials buried 3 layers deep. A pattern so careful, so patient, that it could only have been built by someone who fully expected Charles Whitmore to die before anyone noticed. 5 years, Charles said, his voice hollow, staring at the numbers. He's been stealing from me for 5 years, and I was too busy drowning to see it. You weren't drowning, sir, Grace said quietly. You were grieving. There's a difference. And grief doesn't make you responsible for someone else's greed. Charles looked at her, something flickering behind his tired eyes. You have a way of saying exactly what I need to hear at exactly the moment. I don't want to hear it. My grandmother used to say the truth doesn't care about your timing. Despite everything, despite the weight pressing down on that room, the corner of Charles's mouth twitched not quite a smile, but close enough that Harold, standing by the door, felt something loosen in his own chest for the first time in days. The relief didn't last long. 2 days later, Vanessa Cole showed up at the mansion unannounced, dressed in cool authority, carrying a leather folder and a smile so practiced it never touched her eyes. Charles, she said warmly, stepping into his study like she owned it. I heard you've been unwell. I brought the quarterly reports myself, thought you'd want a familiar face. How thoughtful, Charles said flatly. If Vanessa noticed the ice in his voice, she didn't show it. Her eyes drifted to Grace, standing quietly near the window. And something cold passed behind her expression before the mask slid back into place. And who's this? My new kitchen staff, Charles said. Kitchen staff. Vanessa repeated slowly, attending private business meetings. She stays, Charles said, in a tone that ended the conversation before it started. Vanessa's smile tightened at the corners. She sat down across from him, crossed her legs, and slid the folder across the desk. The board's grown concern. Charles, your absence from the last 4 meetings. Rumors about your health. Richard's been carrying the company on his back, and frankly, some members are wondering if it's time to formalize what's already happening in practice. You mean the vote? I mean, Vanessa said carefully, that 6 weeks from now, you'll either walk into that boardroom strong enough to prove them wrong, or you won't. And if you won't, Charles, the transition will happen whether you're there to witness it or not. Charles leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made even Vanessa shift in her seat. Tell me something, Vanessa, he said quietly. In 3 years working under Richard, did you ever once ask yourself why a man who claims to care about my recovery has never not once visited me in this house? Vanessa's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Richard's been extremely busy protecting the company you built. Is that what he told you? Or is that what you needed to believe so you could sleep at night? The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Vanessa stood abruptly, gathering her folder with hands that weren't quite steady. I'll tell Richard you're feeling paranoid. Wouldn't be the first time grief made him imagine things that aren't there. Grief, Charles said, standing to match her, didn't put a sedative in a box of chocolates addressed to my new employee. Vanessa, someone did that, and I intend to find out exactly who. For just a fraction of a second, so brief, Grace almost missed it. Something like real fear flashed across Vanessa Cole's composed face before she turned and walked out without another word. That fear proved to be justified, because within 24 hours, Richard Colton learned that his poison gift basket had been intercepted, tested, and traced. And a cornered man, Grace was about to learn, was infinitely more dangerous than a confident one. The first attack wasn't physical. It was worse. It was public. A story broke online anonymously, sorts, conveniently timed, accusing Grace Bennett of manipulating the mentally unstable, grieving billionaire for personal financial gain. Screenshots, doctored to look damning, showed Grace supposedly requesting large sums of money from Charles's accounts. Comments flooded in within hours, strangers who'd never met her calling her a con artist, a predator, a gold digger preying on a broken old man. Grace read every single comment with shaking hands, sitting alone in the kitchen at 2 a.m., tears blurring the screen. Diego found her there. Grace, none of this is real. Anyone who knows you knows this is garbage. It doesn't matter if it's real, Grace whispered. It matters that people believe it. That's all it takes. The next morning, Miss Patterson pulled her aside, and for the first time since Grace arrived, the older woman's stern composure cracked completely. I warned you, Miss Patterson said, voice tight with something between anger and fear. I told you to be careful. This is what happens to people who threaten Richard Colton's plans. He doesn't fight fair, Miss Bennet. He never has. So what am I supposed to do? Quit? Let him win. I'm supposed to tell you to protect yourself, Miss Patterson said. Then, quieter, almost against her own will, but honestly, I hope you don't. This house hasn't felt alive in 5 years. Don't let them take that away from us now. Grace found Charles in his study that afternoon, staring at his own phone, at the same doctored screenshots, his face unreadable. I didn't do this. Grace said immediately, none of it's true. I've never asked you for money. I never would. I know, Charles said quietly, cutting off her panic before it could spiral further. You know, Grace, I've read balance sheets my entire life. I know exactly what a fabricated transaction record looks like versus a real one. He set the phone down. Richard's getting desperate. Desperate men make careless mistakes. This doesn't feel like a mistake, Grace said, voice trembling. It feels like he's trying to destroy me. He is, Charles said simply, because he's finally realized what I already know. What's that? Charles looked at her, and for the first time, there was nothing broken in his expression at all, only quiet, unshakable conviction. That you're the only person in 5 years who's managed to make me want to keep living. And a man like Richard can survive my grief. He built his entire plan around my grief. What he can't survive, Charles said, standing, is my recovery. He walked to his desk, picked up his phone, and dialed a number Grace didn't recognize. Marcus, he said, I want everything you have on Richard and Vanessa on my desk by tomorrow morning. Every transaction, every email, every phone record you can legally pull. And Marcus's voice hardened into something Grace hadn't heard from him before. Something that sounded exactly like the billionaire who'd built an empire from nothing called the board. Tell them I'm not just attending the meeting in 6 weeks. Tell them I'm moving it up to next week. Grace's heart pounded as she watched him hang up the phone, watched 5 years of grief transform, right in front of her, into something sharp and dangerous and very much alive. Whatever Richard and Vanessa thought they were dealing with when they targeted a quiet, unassuming maid from a small catering background, they were about to discover they'd made the single worst mistake of their entire careers because they hadn't just underestimated Grace. They'd underestimated exactly how far a man was willing to go to protect the one person who'd finally taught him how to live again. The boardroom had never been so full. Word had spread fast. Charles Whitmore, the man half the company assumed was on his deathbed, had personally moved up the vote by 5 weeks. Board members who hadn't seen him in over a year filed in with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion, whispering behind their hands the moment they saw him walk through those doors standing tall. Jaw said, eyes clear for the first time in half a decade. Richard was already seated at the head of the table, a folder of prepared remarks in front of him, his composure cracking just slightly the moment he saw his uncle walk in without a cane, without a nurse, without a single sign of the fragile man he'd spent months describing to the board behind closed doors. Uncle Charles, Richard said, forcing a smile. You're looking well. Am I? Charles said, taking his seat at the head of the table without breaking eye contact. Funny. I would have thought you'd be disappointed. A ripple of confused murmurs moved through the room. Richard's smile faltered. I don't know what you mean. Then let me help you remember, Charles said, nodding to Marcus Reyes, standing quietly by the door with a laptop under his arm. The screen at the front of the room lit up. What followed was 14 minutes that would end an empire built on lies. Wire transfers. Shell companies. Vendor contracts inflated by millions. The overages disappearing into accounts traced directly back to Richard Colton and, disturbingly, to Vanessa Cole, seated 3 chairs down, her face draining of color with every new slide. Then came the lab report. Then came security footage from the mansion's kitchen delivery entrance. Time-stamped it, showing a courier later identified and already cooperating with investigators, dropping off a gift basket personally requested and paid for by Richard Colton's corporate card. "This is insane," Richard said, standing so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "This is a fabrication, this is." "Sit down, Richard," Charles said. And something in his voice, steady, cold, absolutely certain, made even the most skeptical board members lean forward. "You tried to poison a member of my household staff." Charles continued, "to remove the one person who was helping me recover. Because my recovery was a direct threat to 5 years of theft you'd been quietly bleeding from this company." He looked around the table, at faces now shifting rapidly from confusion to horror. "I've already spoken with the district attorney's office. Formal charges are being filed this afternoon." Vanessa was the first to break, standing abruptly, gathering her things with trembling hands. "I want a lawyer." "I'm not saying another word. That," Charles said quietly, "would be the first intelligent decision you've made in 3 years." Richard didn't move. He sat frozen at that table, the empire he'd spent 5 years quietly stealing collapsing in real time in front of every person whose respect he'd need to survive what came next. And for the first time in his life, Richard Colton had absolutely nothing left to say. The board vote that followed wasn't close. Charles Whitmore retained full control of the company he'd built from nothing, unanimous. With formal proceedings launched against both Richard and Vanessa before the meeting had even fully adjourned. Security escorted Richard from the building within the hour. Past employees who watched in stunned silence, past a lobby full of cameras that would broadcast his downfall on every business channel in the country by evening. Charles didn't watch him go. He was already walking out a different door, moving faster than Harold had seen him move in 5 years. Heading straight back to the mansion, back to the kitchen where a woman with no culinary degree and no expensive resume was quietly making dinner, completely unaware that the empire trying to destroy her had just crumbled to dust. "It's over," Charles said, standing in the kitchen doorway. Still in his suit, slightly out of breath, Grace turned, wooden spoon still in hand. "What's over?" "All of it, Richard." "Vanessa. The lies." He stepped closer, something raw and unguarded in his face. "You saved my life, Grace. Not just tonight. Every single day since you walked through that door." Grace set down the spoon, her eyes filling despite herself. "I just made you soup, Mr. Whitmore." "No," Charles said, shaking his head. "You didn't save my appetite. You reminded me why life is still worth tasting." For the first time since Eleanor's death, truly the first time in 5 long years, Charles Whitmore smiled. Not the tight, polite smile he gave to cameras and board members. A real one. Fragile, unpracticed, but entirely genuine. Not because the grief was gone, but because, for the first time, he wasn't carrying it alone. Months passed, and the mansion that had once felt like a mausoleum slowly filled with something it hadn't held in years' life. Charles returned to running his company with a clarity and energy that stunned executives who'd written him off completely. But everyone who knew him best agreed the biggest change wasn't in the boardroom at all. It was at his dinner table, every single night, where Grace still sat across from him, not as a maid anymore. Though she'd never once asked for a title, or a raise, or anything at all beyond the job she'd started with. So Charles asked her directly one evening, setting down his fork, studying her the way a man studies someone he's finally learned to trust completely. "What do you want, Grace? Truly, name it. And it's yours." Grace didn't hesitate. "I want you to build kitchens, community kitchens, in every city your company operates in. Places where seniors who eat alone every night the way you used to can come sit at a table with someone else, even just once a day." Charles stared at her. stunned into silence for a long moment. "That's it?" he finally asked. "No money for yourself? No apartment, no?" "I don't need those things," Grace said simply. "My grandmother used to say the loneliest people in the world aren't the ones with empty wallets. They're the ones with empty chairs across from them." She met his eyes. "You had an empty chair for 5 years, Mr. Whitmore. I don't want anyone else to have to sit there for that long." Charles invested over $200 million into what would become the Eleanor Whitmore Community Kitchens, dozens of them, then hundreds, spreading across the country, filled every single evening with elderly men and women who'd forgotten what it felt like to eat a meal surrounded by voices instead of silence. Grace remained exactly who she'd always been: humble, quiet, uninterested in the spotlight that occasionally found her anyway when journalists discovered the extraordinary story of the maid who healed a billionaire with nothing but soup and honesty. But those closest to the Whitmore mansion knew the truth ran far deeper than any headline could capture. Grace hadn't simply fed a hungry man. She had sat beside a broken one, refused to leave when everyone else had given up, and reminded him one bowl, one conversation, one honest question at a time exactly what it meant to be alive again. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that ever truly mattered.